Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, sorry. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry for that. I was getting ahead of myself there. My name is Patrick Butler. I'm Social Policy Editor of The Guardian. I'd like to welcome you to this evening's session, An Unequal World Beyond Levelling Up. And I'm delighted to introduce the authors of these two excellent illuminating books, Cogs and Monsters, What Economics Is and What It Should Be, by Diane Coyle, who is on my right, immediately on my right, and After the Virus, Lessons from the Past for a Better Future, by Hilary Cooper and Simon Szreter, who are on my far right here. Welcome, and we will hear from all three of the authors. And we'll follow this with a discussion and then plenty of time for you to ask questions of the panel at the end. First, a word about one of the evening's pressing topics, really, after the virus. And I read Hilary and Simon's book 2 weeks ago when I was actually in the attic room of my home isolating because I had COVID. So it was an interesting read, I have to say, and it was definitely not after the virus, as we know. We're not out of the woods. Hilary and Simon, I noticed, wrote the first draft in December 2020, which feels like a lifetime ago, I have to say. And the final draft was finally completed, I think, in around spring 2021, which again feels quite long ago. And I know as a journalist that when you're writing about unfolding events, it can be particularly treacherous, particularly if you're writing a book. I mean, it's hard enough when you're writing day to day on events. But I think one of the powerful things about this book, in fact about both these books, is that they don't in the slightest bit feel outdated and or behind the times. In fact, they do feel still very contemporary to where we are now, and I think we'll discuss some of those contemporary issues when we get onto the discussion. Both books provide a frame, really, not just for understanding what happened in the first year of the pandemic and how we might understand what came next, but also what will happen in the future. What COVID revealed about UK society, Simon Hilary described it as a kind of social X-ray, was in that it was able to offer us sort of lessons, a diagnosis in a way of where we were and how we got there, and also lessons about how we deal with the evolving pandemic too. And as we now know, the cost of living crisis and related crises, and how we as a society respond to that and forthcoming crises. Without further ado, let's kick off. We're first going to hear from Professor Simon Szreter, who is Professor of History and Public Policy and a Fellow of St. John's College. He's an Honorary Research Associate of the Cambridge Group for the History of Population and Social Structure, and a member of the Centre for Science and Policy. Simon, please.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Well, our book, as we say on the cover, in effect, is using history to attempt to inform public policy. And in fact, I also edit a 20-year-old website called History and Policy. Google it, go and have a look. It's got lots of great stuff by my colleagues, other historians, writing short, accessible pieces for you on that website. So why is history so important in our exposition? Firstly, I think it explains why we were so vulnerable, and we were vulnerable when this COVID pandemic hit. And that requires an exposition of recent history about the last 30, 40 years, and particularly the last 10 years. And Hilary will talk about that shortly. But secondly, it's very interesting that there is a deeper history that is highly relevant. There's a very, very important revisionist historiography, as we call it, other historians' work that's appeared over the last 40 years or so, which carries an enormous punch, a great surprise, and history is very good at this when historians find things out about the past that we thought we knew, but actually we discover we weren't right. For a very long time, it's been thought that there was something that the welfare state is a 20th century creation. The name of beverage springs to mind for everybody. This is something that happens after societies become democratic and wealthy, so they can tax themselves and have public services, social security, and so on. The extraordinary surprise of early modern British historiography, and I'm talking about 50 or more books that have come out in the last 40 years, all researching different things, many, many, many articles, is that Britain endows itself with a welfare state, in effect, under Elizabeth I, not Elizabeth II. Elizabeth I, our welfare system, she and her advisors, particularly Lord Burleigh, they create a universal system of social security and welfare. It's called the Poor Laws. These are statutes, very important, passed in 1598 and 1601, which produce the effect that no subject of the crown is legally permitted to starve. That is the bottom line of this statute. Every parish, 10,000 parishes, is obliged to tax itself, to tax its wealth, in order that it supports all, and it's explicitly stated, orphans, widows, the ill, the elderly. They are all to be supported all the time, and indeed the involuntarily unemployed. This is a full system of social security support, according, by our modern lights. And it comes into being in statute in 1601, and it is rolled out and it is developed over the next few decades, and it's very much in existence in the late 17th through the 18th, early 19th century. And we know this because we can see that England alone, in the whole of Western Europe, its population ceases to experience famine when dearth occurs. Dearth is a problem for all of Europe and all early modern societies. Harvest failure means prices rocket up, people die, either in the year of the failure or the year after. Because we have the demographic evidence from my colleagues here in Cambridge, we can see this relationship ceases to occur across England after 1624. And that is 150 years earlier than the rest of Western Europe. So we have hard evidence that this system really existed. It wasn't just a statute that Elizabeth I signed. It was really existing. We've got plenty of other evidence as well about that. So we're arguing that what we have in England as a result of the Poor Law is what we call a collectivist individualist society. These are two terms that are often thought in philosophy to be opposites of each other. We're saying if you look at British history, we are seeing them both running together. The collective of the parish supporting all of its individuals so that, crucial thing that is possible, the younger generation can leave the parish for work. They can go where their opportunities are best. And they know mum and dad are not going to starve without me. The parish will always support them. Also, I can go somewhere and try my luck for a job. If it doesn't work out, I'm not going to starve. I will be returned to my parish of origin by the settlement laws of the Poor Law. What we know, again, a hard fact of all this, is that Britain's rate of urbanisation between 1600 and 1800 is 350%. That is 10 times higher than anywhere else in Western Europe. So the Poor Law is facilitating labour mobility, which, as economic historians will tell you, is the source of what's called Smithian economic growth in this period. the division of labour, the specialisation of labour. So the Poor Law is doing all that. It comes to an abrupt end in 1834 with the new Poor Law, new ideas that we would characterise as extreme individualism, forgetting the collectivism. The infamous workhouse comes in, the idea that individuals should just take their prices in the labour market and so on. That lasts for from 1834 until we get through to the post-Second World War welfare state, when William Beveridge, according to the new historiography, rediscovers the principles of collectivist individualism, the modern welfare state. And the two periods in which we have practiced collectivist individualism are the two periods in our history when our economy has been most productive, outstripping the rest of Europe before 1834, and between 1950 and 1973, that is the rate at which our workers in our economy achieved their highest rate of productivity ever in our history. Not a fact that is very well known. That comes to an end, however, in 1979 with the rise of neoliberalism, the same ideas that had got rid of the old Poor Law in 1834 come back to the surface, extreme individualism, which Hilary will now talk about.
Okay, thank you.
I should just introduce Hilary at this point. Hilary is a Cambridge-based economic consultant, researcher and writer. You were a government economist, I believe, and a senior policymaker, and that's your background, Hilary, sorry.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so since 1979, neoliberalism, with its commitment to shrinking the public sphere, has become dominant in political discourse. And we argue that it was this ideology, which was particularly ramped up in the years of austerity, that left us with so little resilience when COVID-19 hit. So COVID was not actually the unpredictable black swan, the once-in-a-100 years event that some have claimed it is. There had in fact been plenty of warning. Documents leaked in 2020 confirmed that a pandemic had for years been the top red risk of the UK's own National Security Risk Register. So planning and stress testing for a pandemic had therefore been routine right up until 2016, which was the year of Exercise Cygnus, which was an exercise that turned out to be our last major rehearsal. That exercise found major deficiencies in our preparedness, including our stocks of PPE and, ominously, the resilience of our care sector. Yet none of this was acted on. Attention and resources were instead diverted away from pandemic planning and into planning for Brexit. And we had a Prime Minister who was so cavalier about the approach of COVID-19 that he missed all 5 COBRA emergency planning meetings in January and in February 2020. But it was not just ineffective planning and inept government that left us exposed. The cuts in public services over a decade of austerity had also left the country peculiarly vulnerable to a shock such as COVID-19. NHS bed capacity had been cut by over 30,000 beds, and that's around 1 in 6 of the total. So that left no provision to respond should there be an emergency, or indeed should there be a normal surge in winter demand. Stockpiles of PPE had been run down against explicit expert advice to build them up, so that for weeks health and care staff were working without adequate protection, and some, as we know, paid for that with their lives. At the same time, the hugely expensive and privatised test and trace system was unable to provide proper intelligence about infections for months into the pandemic. So it seems we couldn't have made ourselves more vulnerable to the shock of an event like COVID-19 if we'd tried. Having removed so many of those NHS beds, in March and April 2020, more than 25,000 elderly patients had to be rapidly discharged from hospitals into care homes to free up that capacity that the NHS had lost. But that was done with an instruction that negative COVID tests were not required. The care home deaths that followed in April and May 2020, running into tens of thousands, are one of the scandals of our pandemic response. But there were more insidious issues. The gig economy and the casualisation of the workforce left many frontline and key workers, that would include taxi and delivery drivers or agency care staff, without adequate or in many cases any sick pay entitlement. Most were in jobs that were too precarious to risk taking time off. And with many therefore working when they were sick, they risked spreading COVID among both their co-workers and their own families and communities. So it's no surprise then that the death rate from COVID turned out to be twice as high in the most deprived fifth of the population as it was in the least deprived fifth of the population. Now, interestingly, as early as April 2020, the Financial Times actually published an editorial that showed an extraordinary insight into these failings and their implications for neoliberalism. So they argued that radical reforms reversing the prevailing policy of the last 4 decades will need to be put on the table. Governments will have to accept a more active role in the economy. They must see public services as investments rather than liabilities, and look for ways to make labour markets less insecure. Redistribution will again be on the agenda, the privileges of the elderly and wealthy in question. Child poverty doubled during the 1980s as Thatcher's neoliberal policies rolled out, rising from 15% to over 30% during her years in power. Falling a little then under New Labour, but now back over 30% and set to rise even further, as we know. Benefits had been deliberately cut during the austerity years, with inflation uprating abolished, a 5-week waiting period before any payments were made, and from 2017, the 2-child policy, no support given for any children after the first 2. Poverty, loan shark debt, and food bank use all soared as a result. Contrast that with the growth in private wealth, which has risen since the 1970s from 3 times the size of our national income to 8 times its size today. Yet, as Torsten Bell, Chief Executive of the Resolution Foundation, points out, wealth taxes have not risen at all and are riddled with problems. This, he says, is not a situation a post-virus Britain can afford. Our book concludes by arguing that we need to revive our historic inheritance of collectivist individualism, as we did so successfully after the Second World War. It proposes 7 pillars to support a return to this empowering society. A nurturing state to provide genuine security and invest now in closing health and educational gaps. Progressive taxation, especially of wealth. Ethical capitalism to focus on long-term value, not short-term shareholder gain, a renewal of democratic institutions to end cronyism and corruption, support for greater participation of local communities, including giving the vote to everyone over 15, living within our environmental limits, and new sustainable goals in place of the elusive chasing after ever higher growth. So to conclude, if COVID was the dress rehearsal for the rest of this century's challenges, then we need urgently to learn its lessons so that we can leave behind the deliberate helplessness of the neoliberal state and commit instead to a new type of morality, one of collective support for people and for the planet.
Thank you, Hilary. And our next speaker is Professor Diane Coyle, who's the Bennett Professor of Public Policy at the University of Cambridge. Diane.
Thanks very much. Another economist. Simon, you're surrounded here. So I'm mainly going to talk about Hilary and Simon's book, which I enjoyed reading a lot. And I think we're at a bit of a turning point. We've had in the past few years the financial crisis of 2008, when it seemed very likely that the world financial system might collapse. People were worried about their savings. We saw the lines outside the banks. And we got to about 4 hours away from the payment systems collapsing so that we wouldn't be able to get cash out or go and pay for groceries. We had the pandemic, which was not, as Hilary said, a bolt from the blue. There'd been plentiful warnings that it was coming, but we were unprepared for it, as indeed many countries were. It wasn't just us. We've now got conflict in Europe, feels very close to home, and the sanctions are very disruptive on global trade and the global financial system, a price that no doubt we're willing to pay, but it is going to have its costs. And then we've got inflation picking up and potentially getting embedded. And anybody who has experienced the 1970s inflation will know how socially corrosive that is. I was a teenager, our family didn't have much money, the wages didn't go up in line with inflation, and my mother stockpiled things when they were on special offer, and we worried a lot about turning the lights off all the time, and we're going into that again. According to the Office of Budget Responsibility, in its review of the economy published with the Chancellor's statement, was it last week or the week before, said that we were in for more years of real incomes not going up at all. They haven't gone up since the mid-2000s. And this will be, I think I'm saying this with some diffidence because I'm next to a proper historian, but I think it will be the longest period of no improvement in living standards since the Industrial Revolution. And we do now live in democracy, and I don't think that's going to be sustainable. So I think the time is ripe for the shift in public philosophy that Simon and Hilary have been talking about the role of markets vis-à-vis the state, vis-à-vis other kinds of institutions, organizing the way that we make things and distribute things in society. And we have had these 40-plus years of emphasis on individualism and markets, a very deliberately crafted public policy by think tanks, by economists, and also by politicians. It's often described as neoliberalism. I don't like the term myself because I think it disguises a lot of differences, and being an economist, some economists are called, all economists are sometimes called neoliberals, and I think we're very different from each other. But regardless, I think we are now going to see more focus on the collective and less on the individual. And perhaps we can come back to collectivist individualism, because I'm one of the people who thought they were opposites, and that might be interesting to talk about a little bit, your terminology. And that's not least because of the digital economy and intangibles, which is actually much more what my book is about. A lot of digital items like data or software or creative content that you view online has the character of public goods, things that are most easily paid for and consumed collectively than individually. Markets don't work very well when they have these characteristics of big upfront costs, but very low incremental costs or marginal costs, as we call them. And so the most efficient way to pay for those is actually to raise taxes and provide them publicly. And a lot of digital goods are like that. They're like sewage systems or road networks and so on. And I think we are, not least because of the pandemic, going to have to see much more collective provision of NHS capacity. It's very clear from some work that I've done with colleagues that COVID mortality and cases were linked to mobility. We use mobile phone records. People who had to go to work were much more likely to experience either a case of COVID or mortality. And those people were the people who are doing the frontline jobs, the key worker jobs, which are also not the best well-paid and not the highest quality jobs in our societies. We also, as a country, experienced a much bigger fall in output, in economic output, because we had such limited NHS capacity that treating COVID patients meant there was a collapse in other treatments in the NHS. And how you combine those to measure GDP is somewhat complicated and differs between countries, but it's very clear that we had a bigger drop in output because we didn't have any spare capacity in the NHS. We're going to get more pandemics, we're going to get more of these zoonotic diseases, and we need to be prepared for that, so we need to invest in that capacity, and in lots of other kinds of capacity as well. So I myself am much more focused on sustainable growth, but growth and innovation and wealth creation, as many politicians like to call it, rather than thinking about the size of the economic pie that we have and redistributing it. But whichever way you look at it, I think it does mean an active role for the state in aligning individual efforts, if you like, in providing infrastructure, in providing industrial policies, setting technical standards, indicating to people that there will be a market for electric cars or new kinds of batteries and so on. If I can do a plug for a website, I'm one of the editors of a site called Economics Observatory, which has a lot of this kind of economic thinking in it about what has happened during the pandemic and what's the kind of future that we face in terms of the economics. So there's a lot of thinking going into it. I think it will be a very different emphasis than in the past. It will not be only markets. We'll think about a much wider array of institutions. And not just the state either. If you think about the Industrial Revolution and all of the innovation in terms of unions and friendly societies and mutual organisations and the co-op that happened at that time as well. Perhaps we're in for that. But I think one of the difficult things is actually the politics of this, because this won't be uncontested. The turkeys are not going to vote for Christmas. The rich people are not going to vote for wealth taxes. And so how we get from the analysis that I think we probably broadly share among ourselves here on the stage and maybe in the room as well, to implementing that is a pretty big question.
Diane,
Thanks,
thank you
Patrick.
very much. In a sense, when Hilary talked about the last 2 years being a dress rehearsal for the challenges to come, and in a sense, we've maybe got our first domestic crisis, which is the cost of living crisis. And I wondered what lessons you would draw from the past 2 years in terms of understanding why we have a cost of living crisis and how we might overcome the cost of living crisis. I don't know who wants to start here.
I mean, I think one of the lessons is not thinking forward, not planning. This sort of the whole characteristic of a hands-off, leave it to the market state. So it was probably reasonably predictable that when the economies started to get back on their feet after the pandemic, there might be some dislocation of supplies, there might be surges in prices, there might be some issues over getting supply chains and energy in place. We had no effective plan for energy stocks to prevent, unpredicted price rises. But also just given that there were predictions of inflation coming through around the turn of the year, and the Bank of England certainly was predicting that, should we have thought through whether cutting universal credit back down by £20 was the sensible thing to do when we knew that the next benefit increase was going to be based on last September's inflation increase, which was only 3.1%, and we knew there was a cost of living crisis coming. So I suppose the general message is the short-sightedness of a state that isn't really engaged.
But it's not just short-sightedness, is it? Because some of it has taken everybody by surprise, because we've had over the past 30 years these extended production chains, everything's very specialist. So there are lots more bottlenecks in the system than we, I think, had got our minds around. So if you think about the fertilizer factory that turned out to produce 2/3 of the carbon dioxide needed in the food processing industry, I met their finance director. They had no idea they were that bottleneck. So I think some of it is actually that we just haven't got our heads around the way the economy has changed, although I completely agree about not thinking through the implications for people on low incomes.
Yeah. And I think I would just add that if you want a cost of living crisis, try a harvest failure in the past. And our country managed to work out how you deal with that. Because this cost of living crisis is not for someone like myself who's lucky to be on a professional salary. It's for people who are on lower salaries and lower incomes. And that's to do with what kind of a social security system have we created for ourselves, or have we actually cut? The £20 uplift is a sick joke, actually, because if you look at the cuts that have occurred as a result of the freezes on benefits imposed since 2015, is it?
Earlier, 11, 12, yeah.
That for kind of average poor, the Resolution Foundation has showed for average poor families, that means they're already 1 to 2 or even £2,500 worse off per year than they were in real terms than just 5 or 6 years ago. And then we're all arguing about whether a £20 a week, which is just £1,000, is generous or not generous. These people have already had they've already been taken off at the knees, and they're using food banks. We don't have to have a social security system like that. If we don't have to vote for governments that do this to us.
Diane, was there a failure of So economics here, or was it just a refusal to see the evidence? Because I recall last summer visiting food banks, and they were talking about the cost of living crisis, and they saw it amongst their clientele all the time. And I was aware that in October, the government was, as it prepared to cut the £20 uplift, it was adamant that the economy was opening up, and we don't need this anymore. And was this a failure of advice, do you think? Or was it just a refusal on ideological grounds to see, what needed to be done?
I think most economists were pretty clear that it should not be cut, that the £20 should be left in place, that having so many people using food banks is not a good system. It does not make us a wealthy country to have people who are not properly nourished. They're not going to be productive if they do have jobs. So we've got people like the Resolution Foundation, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, consistently saying that these were redistributing in the wrong direction, and it was a political choice.
Yes, and what I would say is, in terms of what the ideological thinking may have been, when they cut that when they removed the £20 uplift, they also did this very complicated thing of changing the taper, which is how much money you can keep when you go back into work. And if you look at that, and if you look at what they did in the spring statement a couple of weeks ago, all of the focus is on the idea that we'll make things better for people who work. So when they say the economy is picking up last October and they changed the taper so that people can keep more of their income when they go back to work, they're basically saying, yes, we'll do something to help the low paid who are going into jobs, but not the people who are out of work. And that's exactly what they did in the spring statement. They changed taxes and tax thresholds on that and raised the national insurance threshold, which is of no use at all if you're not in work. And everyone said that instead of cutting 5p off fuel duty, they should have done something for benefits to recognise the fact that they hadn't gone up with inflation. And it's the same philosophy. They were not focused on people out of work. They wanted to focus on people in work. And Rishi Sunak said that, I'm helping hardworking families. Hardworking
families. Its spring statement was interesting, wasn't it? Because it didn't really go down well with it did go down with the left, obviously, but parts of the right it didn't go down with. I don't think the Daily Express even liked it. And what do you think this tells us, this kind of broadly negative reception for the spring statement as a kind of response to the cost of living crisis? What do you think this tells about how ready society might be to change, and what society more broadly might have learned from the last 2 years? Simon?
Yeah, I think that it was interesting that there seemed to be, I haven't looked at the responses of people like the Adam Smith Institute and so on, but certainly as was reported in the media, there didn't seem to be many friends the next day, although there was plenty of clapping in the chamber on the day, but then it seemed very quickly that the vast majority, including a lot of even Conservative MPs, were thinking maybe this wasn't such a good deal after all. So I think that does show that there's an accumulation of feeling about unfairness and concern for not just the poor, but of course, many of the workers in the economy who are having to use food banks even though they're in work. I think that's something that maybe is beginning to really get through to a lot of people, that you can't just have this stuff about budgets for hard-working families, which was the kind of previous mantra, when it's beginning to be rather obvious that a lot of hard-working families are still having to go to food banks, and that's actually before what we're about to face. So the gas price thing seems to me this will be make or break for this government. Either they will have to really change tack in a very big way, or I suspect the nation's going to vote them out, and possibly they're going to have a lot of trouble even before the next election.
I don't know if we're allowed to mention the B word, but the collapse in trade and the difficulty for farmers is alienating lots of traditional Conservative supporters anyway. And I don't think you have to be a raving left-winger to notice that food banks are being used by people who are in work, that the streets are full of potholes. Most people use the NHS and send their children to state schools, and they know that they're underfunded and that you can't get a medical appointment easily. So I think it's very evident to lots of people that the economy is just not going well at the moment. And so the same mantras aren't going down as well as they used to.
Do you think we're reaching a turning point in the sense that people can make that connection between what they see and what they experience and to where they put their votes at the next election? And do you, without wanting to get into party politics, do you think there'll be an alternative for them to vote for?
I don't know about the alternative, but voters don't like inflation. And so if inflation picks up and it's energy bills and everybody's affected, I don't think that will play well at the polls. So I'll let somebody else talk about the alternatives.
Yeah, I think also, is this working now? Yeah. I think also, I wrote an article with Danny Dorling before the 2015 election, I think, in the Prospect magazine, in which we pointed out that the 99 constituencies in the country that had the highest child poverty rate did not have a single Conservative MP representing them. And that's no longer true because of Boris Johnson's result in the last election. So that I think that there are a considerable number of MPs in the Conservative Party who, in their constituencies, in their surgeries, are presumably actually having to face up to some of these really, really deep problems, which I think most Conservative MPs saw very little of before this. And I think there is some evidence that a lot of the less loyal MPs in some of the votes are coming from that group. So I think, yes, for various reasons, messages are getting through.
Before we open questions up to the audience, I wanted to come back to this phrase, collectivist individualism. I know, Diane, you wanted to talk about this too, because I found it a very fascinating term. And in some ways I wanted you to explain it a bit more in terms of, are there any signs out there that we may be seeing it, and in what form might we see it?
Well, I suppose being a historian, one is relatively unencumbered with or at least not so impressed with philosophical niceties and logical things. One is studying society as it actually is. Collectivism and individualism obviously can be, passed in philosophical logic and in political thought as being opposites. And there are traditions of thinkers on, famous traditions, Rousseau on one side and John Locke on the other side, and so on. So there's an enormous kind of investment in elaborating the different systems of thinking that come from emphasizing collectivism or emphasizing individualism. But when one looks at English history, and it wouldn't only be English history, when one looks at the way societies actually work for most of the time, for most of history, not just English society, they are a radical mix of the two. Yes, we are all individuals, of course we are. But, we've all grown up in families of various extents and sizes, and that's already a collective that you're part of from the start. You don't have much choice in that. We all work and we live in collective units of larger size. We get we interact with them. But so to study and understand society in time, you are looking at both collectivism and individualism going on in a dialectic with each other. And the argument is that in England, you've got a particularly elaborate form of this because we are a society which unusually has been a society of what's called nuclear family households. Since way back before the Industrial Revolution, it used to be thought that nuclear, mum, dad, and children in a household, nobody else, no grandpa, no uncle and aunt, no siblings. Nuclear family household, that was thought as being something that was a modern thing, and surely in the past we all sat round the hearth and Uncle Tom Cobley and and extended families and all one happy thing and so on. But you can go back to the 16th century in England with very, very good evidence and find that we were already a society of nuclear family households. And the big problem with nuclear family households is, how do you support the elderly when you're not one big happy extended family? And the solution to that for England in the early modern period was the poor law, was the statutory solution. There were already things like it before that, but it becomes a statutory thing. So you can see in our society we are managing a quite developed form of individualism. We are an individualist, liberty-loving nation, but we can only do it if we are collectively supported. Our families that we live in need collective support.
Diane, I sensed a bit of scepticism, really, am I wrong, about the idea of collectivist individualism?
No, I think that explanation makes a lot of sense to me. It reminds me of a famous comment by Herbert Simon, a previous economics Nobel laureate, about if a Martian looked down at the economic organization on Earth, they wouldn't see markets and state as diametrically opposed opposites. They would see all kinds of other institutions. Firms are not markets, they're collective institutions. And yet in economics, we've got this tradition of thinking of them as if they were somehow individualist entities, and that's not at all the case. And there is this richer tradition of institutional economics that thinks about different structures of collective organization. And yet within those, there are people making individual choices about how to maximize their profits or how to maximize their incomes. So that makes sense. Thank you.
Hilary, last question before we go to the audience. And I was interested in your idea of the empowering state and the state having an active role. And in some ways, politically, this has been kind of anathema for, at least in some parts of the media and political discourse. Do you think that the last 2 years has made people reassess the idea of the nurturing state, the empowering state, that people are actually more positive and more embracing of the concept?
I think it has, because, one thing that Rishi Sunak did very quickly, which was very effective, was the establishment very quickly of furlough, the continuation of furlough for longer than originally planned, which did protect the labour market, did protect workers, and the business support schemes. And I think that, what people have seen is that if there's actually a political will, then very good things can be done that are very beneficial, and nothing falls over. So I think there's a very, obviously we've increased our debt, but actually even the most recent report by the Office for Budget Responsibility charted a very understandable track out of that that's not a kind of deal breaker, if you see what I mean. And I think that what people have seen, become aware of, is the educational inequalities. The fact that a lot of children during the pandemic didn't have access to laptops to work effectively remotely when they weren't able to go into school, I think made people realise that inequality of access to technology and to learning, with laptops at home, actually was already a problem. I think that people have become much more aware of the care sector, and obviously, we've had recent attempts to address some of the problems with care in old age. But so I think these issues are a lot further up people's thinking and agenda, and I think that people have seen, what can actually be done. So yes, I mean, I'm a bit more optimistic.
Good. I'm going to open up questions to the audience now. If you could raise your hand, and then one of our team could get a mic to you. We've got a questioner here. If you could say who you are, and we've got about 15 minutes left, so if you keep your question fairly succinct, that would be really helpful. Is that on?
Hello? Yeah, perfect. My name is Owen, and I've got one clarification, one question. So for Simon, you mentioned the lack of famines during the Poor Law. Was that complete removal of famines, or just a large reduction in the effect of them?
So what happens is that a famine causing mortality on any significant scale, regional level, not national but regional level. The last time we see that in England for sure is 1623, 1624 in the north of the country. There is some continuing debate about one or two other ones, but the best evidence that I've read is confirming that that's true. And if it isn't true, there might be possibly just one other case sporadically. But what we don't get is the kind of things that are happening, sadly, extensively in Ireland, in Scotland, in France, in all over Western Europe.
Okay, yeah. And I can't remember which one of you mentioned fight back against more progressive policies coming. Do you have any idea what form that would take? Because I was thinking it'd be like the robber barons in America, where the rich use their political influence to challenge political. But do you see any other way of it happening?
Well, I can have a go at that. Both the US and the UK are societies with increasing concentration in important markets like digital markets, and executives paying themselves salaries hundreds of times, 200, 300 times the average in their company. And I do see signs that kind of market power is finally being tackled through very boring economic processes like antitrust policy, which seems to be the vehicle for having a go at some of these concentrations of power. President Biden appointed some very prominent critics of big tech. So I think that's starting to happen. But I think it was me who said that this will not change without a political contest, that although we've all said we think there's a turning point sort of happening, people fight about these turning points. And it takes political organisation and it takes political parties to bring it about.
Sorry.
Oh, thank you very much. Stick them on my head, they're safer there.
Yeah, thank you.
Do we yes, we have a question in the middle and a question on the left.
Maybe I could just pass it to you. Maybe easier.
This is where you get to make the person with the mic run around all the time. Yeah.
Where's it going?
Sorry. Thank you. Hi, I'm James, and I was just wondering, Diane, you said that we should be reinvesting in the NHS to improve its productivity or efficiency. How would you go about doing that, since we're kind of lacking on labour as our main issue at the moment?
Well, that's a big question, and I'm not an expert on the NHS. So I think of it as being part of the infrastructure of the country, like power stations or railway lines. And when you think about investing in infrastructure, you always build in some spare capacity. But we haven't done that with the NHS. We've run it red hot all the time, getting the numbers of spare beds down and getting people out of hospital as quickly as possible. And that's the bit that needs to change. It takes more money. As you say, we're short of people to work in the NHS, and that's partly because there isn't any planning. It takes 7 years to train a doctor. And not only do we not have that forward planning about the numbers that are needed in the system, we also make people take out 7 years' worth of loans rather than 3 or 4 years' worth of loans to do it. So that's a bad incentive structure anyway. And there will have to be some innovations, making sure that all hospitals have electronic patient record systems and that they connect up properly with all of the diagnostics that get done in hospital, because lots of hospitals still have very inefficient paper systems. Using remote monitoring for people who've got conditions so that you get early intervention. So there are lots of things that people are talking about that all needs that upfront investment to make it possible and to have that bit of spare capacity. Because it's actually economically inefficient to run things so red hot and not have any spare capacity.
Okay, thank you very much.
And we have another question here.
Thank you. My name is Hannah. I'm just reading out a question on behalf of someone watching online. And the question is, has the world always been unequal, and do attempts to level up always fail?
Attempts to level up always fail.
Oh, I see. No, the world's been very varied in its inequality. And there's a famous book by the French economist Thomas Piketty, which demonstrated this very strongly, that inequality had increased probably in the course of the 18th century and the early 19th century to a peak just before the First World War, and that then across the period of the 2 world wars and the so-called post-war golden age, or Trente Glorieuses as they're called in France, for a long period, so about 70 or 80 years, most of the 20th century, inequality went in the opposite direction. We became more equal societies, coinciding with becoming full democracies of both female and male voters. And evidently also associated with very high progressive taxation rates becoming normalized. Hardly anybody under the age of about 50 knows or realizes that for 3 decades, starting in the Second World War, but continuing for 2 or 3 more decades into the 70s, not only the United Kingdom, but also the USA, had the highest rates of taxation for both wealth and income of over 80%, in fact over 90% in some cases. So that means, you know, somebody earning today's equivalent of £500,000 a year would be paying 90% in tax on every pound above 300,000 a year. So it's close to being a maximum income policy, completely accepted and tolerated by the Conservative Party, by the Americans, because they realised that it was better, you know, the society had been set up that way and it was working very well, and they could see the entire nation getting educated. They could see a free NHS. Trade unions were comfortable with this. This worked very well for 3 or 4 decades until people got greedy.
But Diane, the world has changed since then, hasn't it? It's a much more global world, isn't it?
Yes, so it worked well until it didn't. And I don't think it was just greed that changed that. It was the fact of economic crisis in the late 1970s around the Western economies, the US, UK, Western Europe. And it was that broad crisis triggered by the same kind of events we have now of commodity price shocks, inflation, very slow growth, income stopping going up. It was that sort of combination, that nexus of problems, I think, that helped pave the way for political decisions to move away from that high tax redistributive system.
Yeah, there was a loss of confidence in amongst certain groups. Yeah, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's...
Yeah.
We had property taxes too. We had something called Schedule A income tax, where you were taxed as a homeowner on the rent that you would have paid if you'd been renting your house. And that was abolished in the late 1960s, I believe. But until then, accepted as a perfectly normal part of taxing people's wealth. It's the way most people hold their wealth.
Yeah.
We have another questioner. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Scala. Maybe just a different type of question. In a lot of your research, you're clearly talking about low-income earners, and I'm interested if there's any efforts that are taken in part of your research to have consultation or engagement with people, because I sense that we're sitting here having a conversation about low-income earners, like how do they come into your research and inform it and become part of that process of understanding and maybe stating their needs, not necessarily just assuming them from, economic studies, etc.
I have one bit of research I can talk about before handing over. We were looking at well-being and rather than conventional economic measures, and two or three of my colleagues worked with a poverty charity called Turn to Us, which gives people grants and helps them apply for benefits. We wanted to understand what people who had that experience said about what improved their own well-being. Economists make certain assumptions, and it's all the obvious things like incomes and do you have a job, but also social aspects. Do you participate in organised religion? Are you married? And so on. And they went through a very intensive process of what's called co-production in the academic jargon, which is working with people that you're studying to frame the questions that you are researching, and found out that, of course, income matters to people who don't have much money, but actually it was the autonomy and the ability to work their way through the system. So what they really wanted was people to help guide them through the system of applying for things, that kind of autonomy.
Yeah,
Hilary.
I mean, I think in our work, no, we haven't directly engaged with lower income workers or non-workers or people at any level, because we've been using secondary sources. So, we were working through the pandemic, looking at the analysis that had been done and looking at the analysis of the impacts of things like budget statements and decisions over distribution of changes during all of those sort of political economy events. I am actually about to become involved in a project being run from within Cambridge, looking at how the pandemic has affected debt levels. And the particular strand that I'm working on is amongst older people, because some of my previous research has been about digital exclusion and other forms of exclusion of older people. So I'm hoping to get a lot more involved in that, and I think that that will be a really interesting project, because clearly debt is a huge issue at the moment.
Anybody who's interested can find ours on the Bennett Institute website if you want to look it up.
And historically, there are some fascinating studies by my colleagues of pauper letters written by the very poor requesting support in various ways. There are some excellent studies by a massive volume by a man called Thomas Sokol, another guy called Steve King, who's edited many of these letters. They're very interesting. They're often written by another person because the poor were not necessarily literate, but you can get quite a strong sense of the problems these people are having. And it also comes up in records of court records is another source historians have been able to use, and private correspondence as well occasionally. So that historians are not short of this kind of evidence and have done a lot with it.
And was there any evidence, Simon, that the policymakers of the time listened to the experiences of on the receiving end, as it were?
The policymakers, as we call them, were designing statutes, and an awful lot of the actual face-to-face encounters were between magistrates, justices of the peace, and overseers of the poor, who were the unpaid officials in every parish, and the poor themselves. And there were, of course, if an overseer had denied somebody their payment because they thought they didn't deserve it, and that person had the right in law to appeal directly to the magistrate. The magistrates were all living locally. It's like this was like the equivalent of legal aid today, which of course has been another enormous, horrific casualty of the last 10 years. But that was terribly important. In any system, it's incredibly important that the poor have access to legal claim in the way our society is set up. And we've got plenty of evidence of that going on in the past. Very, very important for the poor, and they bloody well knew their rights as well, which is very interesting.
At that point, I'm going to have to bring it to a close tonight. And I'd like to thank our audience, Hilary, Simon, Diane, for being so interesting and insightful. And please do go and read their books. I would like to thank you for the audience for coming and listening and asking such good questions. And if you could show your appreciation for our panel in the normal way, thank you. Zero.
Perfect. Thanks.